Hi, my name is Fritzi Horstman. Welcome to Compassion in Action. My guest today is Dr. James Doty, the founder and director of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University, of which His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the founding benefactor. Dr. Doty works with a variety of scientists from a number of disciplines, examining the neural basis for compassion and altruism. He is also a professor in the Department of Neurosurgery at Stanford University School of Medicine. Dr. Doty is an inventor, entrepreneur, and philanthropist, having given support to a number of charitable organizations supporting peace initiatives and providing health care throughout the world. Dr. James Doty, welcome to Compassion in Action.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you, and thank you so much for having me.
So, Mr. Doty, Dr. Doty, as you've become a renowned neurosurgeon and the founder of CCARE, which stands for the Center of Compassion and Altruistic Research, please tell us about your journey from when you were a little child and how you got to the magic shop and then became a neurosurgeon.
Sure. So it's actually the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, and that is at Stanford. And if any of your listeners or viewers want to look that up, that's CCARE, ccare.stanford.edu. But to answer your question, many people look at my own journey or where I am today and make an assumption that I'm a privileged white male, and that explains everything. And the reality is, nothing could be further from the truth, except for the fact that I am a white male. Um, but for many of us who do our work today, it's a manifestation of our past. And for me, I grew up in poverty as a child. We were on public assistance essentially my entire life at home. My father was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke when I was a child, was partially paralyzed, had a seizure disorder, chronically depressed, attempted suicide multiple times. And you can imagine, of course, that is not the appropriate environment to succeed in life. We talk about what is now termed adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and certainly I was a 9 or a 10, which is the highest level of trauma. When you have poverty, mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse, violence, etc., these all increase your scores. And the reality is, as those scores increase, the likelihood for you to achieve success and what our society calls success, having a job, having relationships, etc., uh, decreases as the score goes up. And so the question is, how was I different? And while my parents, I had no doubt, loved me, they, of course, were struggling with their own issues. That being said, I felt ignored, and I was also angry at my parents, at my situation. I had a sense of despair and hopelessness about my future. And when you feel hopeless, unfortunately, the way that translates is oftentimes you're self-destructive, because you don't care about what happens to you, because you feel that no one cares. And as a result, you start doing a variety of behaviors that are not positive, whether it be drugs, alcohol, violence, yourself, becoming a juvenile delinquent. So by the age of 12, I was becoming a juvenile delinquent, and something extraordinary happened. And what happened is that I walked into a magic shop. which of course seems incredibly strange. But what happened there is that it created a situation that allowed for change. And when I would get angry or upset, I would get on my bicycle and try to pedal as fast as I could to get away from the situation. Obviously, you never get away from that situation, but it felt like I could. And on one of those trips, I came across a strip mall, and in the strip mall was a magic shop. And I had an interest in magic, and as a result, um, I went into this magic shop looking actually for a trick. And the woman at the counter, who was in her 50s, turns out she knew nothing about magic in the magic shop because she was the owner's mother. And her son, the magician, was actually out running an errand, and he'd left her in charge to just sit there. And in fact, when I walked in, she was reading a book, and she had these spectacles that were on her nose and a chain around. And but when she looked up, she greeted me with a radiant smile. And it was one that I immediately sensed was non-judgmental. And she looked at me as an equal, not as a 12-year-old, but that my opinion, what I said to her, was actually important and something for her to listen to. And the nature of that type of interaction leads to something we now term psychological safety. You know, in an environment like my own, it's like a war zone in the sense that you never know what's going to happen to you. You know, your father doesn't come home. Is he at a bar? Did something happen? You know, your mother, you come in, she's not responsive. Did she overdose on pills? And so every day, there's no consistency. And in fact, you can be thrown into this horrible situation as a child of trying to manage the behavior of adults. And of course, no child should ever be put into that position. And so this woman and I began a conversation, and she actually started querying me. And she informed me she knew nothing about magic, but she really was interested in me. And normally I would never answer people's personal questions about me because, you know, frankly, if you grow up in poverty, you're ashamed. You're ashamed how you're dressed. You're ashamed of the situation. You're ashamed of all the things that you can't do. And, and, you know, for a child to carry that burden, it's particularly difficult because it's not his or her fault they're in that situation. It's just the nature of the situation. But you still, as a child, blame yourself. So after we talked for 20 or 30 minutes, she said to me, she said, you know, I really like you, and I'm going to be here for another 6 weeks. If you show up every day, I'll teach you something that I think could really help you. And remember, this was before the terms mindfulness or meditation or neuroplasticity were even discussed or in the vocabulary. So I did show up, and it wasn't because I had any insight or self-awareness. The reason I showed up was one, during our conversation, she had a bag of cookies that she would give me. Two, frankly, I had nothing else to do. And this was a person who was kind, nice, open, gentle, which of course is appealing, and that's what all of us want. We want to interact with people who care about us. And I sensed this from her. So I did show up, and over the course of this week, or the 6 weeks, she taught me many things. The first was that coming from my background and this constant chaos and never knowing what's going to happen resulted in me constantly being tense and not be able to focus. Because, if you never know what's going to happen, you basically are always in threat mode. And when you're in threat mode, you don't have access to be as thoughtful or discerning about decision making. What you're interested in is survival. You're not necessarily interested in figuring out the best way or the most thoughtful way to solve a problem. Because when you're in threat mode, this part of your brain called your executive control function, which gives you access to memories, experiences, and makes you much more thoughtful and discerning, isn't available to you. So the first thing she taught me was to do something called a body survey, which I call it relaxing the body in the book. It's essentially just with intention, sitting calmly and going through your muscle groups and relaxing while you're doing a breathing exercise. And that does several things. The nature of the breathing exercises actually shifts you from your threat mode into what we call your rest and digest system. So it shifts you from your sympathetic nervous system into your parasympathetic nervous system. When you're in your parasympathetic nervous system, your physiology actually works its best. Your blood pressure comes down, your pulse comes down, the expression of inflammatory proteins decrease, which is associated with a lot of disease states. Your cortisol levels come down, which is a threat hormone. Your immune system is actually boosted. And so when you're in that state, when you've relaxed everything starts shifting and you're much more open and more thoughtful. And so from that point, what she explained to me was that the commentary or view that I had of myself, which is this voice in your head, which I thought was truth or real, is just made up. It's not real or factual in any way. The problem is, for many people, the way we respond to threat is different than the way we respond to not being threatened. And what I mean by that is, as an example, if you're on the savannah in Africa and you see a blade of grass move, your assumption is that there may be an animal such as a lion there, and you immediately get prepared to react to it, and that could be running away or whatever. And we know those types of threats stick with you. That's how we're wired, because that is associated with saving your life versus when everything is perfect, you have plenty of food, there's no danger around, you're completely relaxed and everything. You don't need that information in those situations. You need it if there's threat. Well, the side effect of that is that when a negative comment is made about you, or you perceive a negative comment, when negative events happen, you have a tendency to then turn those into statements like, well, this happened because I didn't do this. This happened because I'm not smart enough. This happened because I'm not good enough. This happened because I'm really an imposter and I don't belong here. And all of those negative things have a tendency to create a prison for yourself. And every one of them, it's like putting a brick down and building this wall. And as time goes on, the wall starts coming in on you. There are not any windows, it's getting dark, and you're very, very self-focused. And the problem with this, of course, is that so many of us have just immense power to change the world, in fact, but we give it away when we listen to these voices. So she made me recognize this reality, and she used the term, in fact, it was changing the station of the radio. You're listening to one that is filled with this negative commentary. You need to switch channels to one which is positive and one of self-affirmation and acceptance. And that's what happened over a period of time. So I recognized that reality and I changed the dialogue to one of saying, I deserve love, I'm worthy, it's not my fault, I can do anything. Because, once you use the terms, I can't, it's not possible, by definition, that is reality. So I learned to get rid of that terminology. And from that, she made me understand this concept that's fairly well known now of self-compassion, to accept yourself, to accept the good, the bad parts, and also accept that the nature of experience isn't even necessarily related to anything about you. And what I mean by that is that, if a negative event occurs in your life, it can just occur. It's not because you had anything to do with it. And what I mean by that is that when we go through life experiences, there's a tendency to create a narrative as to why they occurred. And in that narrative, and we'll call this picture, if you will, a black and white picture, like the picture behind me of the Dalai Lama. The experience is simply black and white. But what happens is every time we have an event occur, we paint it with the paint of emotion. That is what goes into our memory, not the black and white picture, which is just an event. And the reason I tell you that is that oftentimes when you grow up in these challenging situations, you create all these pictures, and they're pictures that have in them, I'm hurt, I'm in pain, this is why this happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're not real. They're simply events that occurred to you or that occurred, and they have no other meaning than that. Versus saying, well, the reason that happened is he doesn't like me and he was against me, or my parents don't love me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what that allowed me to do, these experiences then, was to shift my perspective, to understand not only that I was worthy of love and being cared for and being accepting of love, but it made me change my perspective, because when you're internally focused because of your own deficiencies and your lack of self-worth and your being ashamed, it stops you from seeing out the rest of the world. And so once I had that perspective, then I could look out and see a different world. And the different world was that, one, essentially everyone's suffering in some way or another. And we have this perception that if you're rich or you're famous or you live in a big house, you drive a nice car, that you don't suffer. And that's a complete fallacy. Some of the most suffering people in the world I know are very wealthy people. But the other side of it is that in general interaction with people, we judge how they're interacting with us based on a narrative of our own pain and suffering and how it plays into that. And oftentimes when people interact with us in a negative way, especially, it has nothing to do with us. It could have had to do with an argument they had with their spouse before they came to work. It could have been due to being cut off in the freeway. It could be due to having a bad meal, all sorts of things. And but we have a tendency to be reactive and look at it from our perspective at that moment without pausing and taking the time to think this through. Because again, emotion regulation is a very, very important aspect of being centered, if you will. As an example, if somebody attacks you, your natural tendency is to attack them back immediately.
Yeah.
And but this can be a big mistake. I tell a story of a colleague I worked with, and we were working on a project. He was much younger than I, and he was changing jobs, and he had 2 children, wife, and he decided, as an example, when he left the job that he wasn't going to take the COBRA insurance. You know, you have to have COBRA insurance to maintain health care. He wasn't going to take it because his family was healthy. It was only a few months, and why spend all that money, right? So he came to see me one day, and we began this conversation, and he became quite surly and aggressive. And my tendency was to go, you know, what the hell are you doing? Why are you doing this? What's wrong with you? Et cetera, et cetera. And I looked at him, and instead of getting into that mode of getting in an argument and confront him, I said, you know, your behavior is just so unusual. What's wrong? He looked up and he started crying. The reason he was crying was his wife had found a lump on her breast, went to the doctor, got a biopsy ultimately, and it was malignant. And here he is, no job, no health insurance, 2 children. And he was terrified. And he didn't have he hadn't reached out or had a support structure to help him. And, you know, when this came out, we went back and were able, fortunately, to get his COBRA insurance. And ultimately, she was treated with surgery. It hadn't metastasized everywhere, and she was fine. But my point is, we make assumptions about people's behavior based on our own pain and suffering oftentimes, not on reality. And, you know, there's a rule that I learned, and I don't know if you're familiar with Viktor Frankl. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and he was a psychiatrist who was placed in a concentration camp during the Holocaust. And he made a statement, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, following stimulus is response. And within the pause between stimulus and response lies your freedom. And what he meant by that is that at some point you will learn to regulate your emotions so that you're not blinded by this immediate sense of your own suffering and issues about you, but you're able to look out and see the reality that other people are suffering. And when you take that pause or that period of time, you start seeing things in a much, much clearer fashion. And so that was an incredible gift to learn that. And so, you know, that was basically, you know, the situation there. So from relaxing the body or to opening the heart, to manifesting compassion, but ultimately, excuse me, somebody is texting me. Sorry. Let me turn off my phone here. The next question is, you know, how do you manifest your intention?
Yes.
And I think, you know, especially with children from my type of a background, you know, you're lost. You don't have mentors, you don't have access, you don't have money. You're afraid of being judged. And as a result, oftentimes very intelligent people hold back because they don't know how to respond. They haven't been taught how to respond. And they're afraid that people are going to judge them. And so what I tell people is that what I learned in this magic shop changed how I looked at the world. Because before I looked at it with fearful eyes that something bad was going to happen, versus changing my perspective of saying, I'm a frail, fragile human being, and everyone in some way is frail and fragile. And when I changed and got rid of the anger, the hostility, the negative emotional states, which limit us so often, and looked at people with this different set of eyes, when I changed how I looked at the world changed how it looked at me.
Amazing.
So this, because people do want to help you, but if they're afraid of you, if you scare them, if you act negatively towards them, a lot of people don't have it within themselves oftentimes to understand why that could be. Obviously, a well-educated person or an insightful person may have that perspective, but a lot don't. So when I changed how I looked at the world, things started opening up for me. And I went from this position of believing that I had no future to believing that I could become a physician, believing that really I could do anything. Because, as I said at the start of our discussions, we have this incredible gift, this incredible power within each of us to do amazing things. We just don't believe it enough. And when you remove those barriers, when you remove the negative emotions, the self-doubt, and you understand that within you is this incredible ability to be what you want, then everything starts changing. And that's what happened to me. You know, interestingly enough, and I'll tell you a couple stories, is we're talking about manifesting intention. So the last thing she taught me was how to do that. And what she's, again, recognized at that point, and now, of course, we have sports psychologists who talk about visualization, et cetera, these are very powerful tools. But she took it further. It wasn't a matter of just thinking about it. It was a matter of writing it down. It was a matter of reading it, repeating it. It was a matter of acting the part, if you will. It was a matter of seeing yourself in that position. Because what happens is that many of us don't appreciate it, but once you set this intention and put it into your subconscious, then your subconscious takes over. I'll give you an example. When I see a patient in my clinic and I diagnose them with a condition, almost invariably they'll say, I've never heard of that. Wow, this is the first time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They come back and see me a few months later and they go, this is amazing. I've run into 5 people who have the exact same thing. Well, why is that? Because you see, it is in their subconscious and they're attuned to hearing this. And so when you're able to put your intention into your subconscious, then this allows you to be attuned to different events that are surrounding you and hone in on it. The reality is we get about, and I may be wrong here, but it's close to this, about 6 million bits of information a second. That's all that comes from all of our sensory organs. Yet we can process only 50 to 100. What that means is we ignore an incredible vast amount of information that's going on around us. So if your subconscious is attuned to that, then things happen which you didn't expect. As an example, I'm sure you've been at a cocktail party or an event and everything is fine, a lot of chatter, you can't even talk yourself. Somebody mentions your name across the room and you immediately turn to it, right?
Yeah.
And that's because you're attuned, again, this is related to threat, but you're attuned to something happening. But if you say, you know, I want to become a doctor, here's what I have to do to get in, you know, set the path for that, things start aligning if your intention is correct. And so I mentioned 3 examples. The first one is when I applied to college. You know, I was in a science class and I knew I wanted to go to college. I had had an experience with a doctor when I was a 4th grader and I was motivated to do that, but I was completely clueless about the process. I knew nothing. And I was sitting in a chair at a desk, and there was a girl next to me, and I looked over, and she was filling out an application. And I looked at this, and I realized it was a college application. And I said to her, I said, oh, wow, you're applying to college. And she said, yeah, the deadlines are coming up. I'm trying to get this done. And I said, oh, wow. And I said, well, where are you going? And she said, well, I'm going to UC Irvine. And I didn't even know what UC Irvine was. And she looked at me and she said, where are you going? And I said, UC Irvine. And I said, but I haven't received my packet yet. And she said, well, I have an extra application. She gave it to me, and I filled it out, and I was accepted to UC Irvine. And that's really how it happened. It wasn't because I had incredible insight or anything, but my subconscious had set the stage for these events to occur. When I applied to medical school, at Irvine, we had a pre-med committee that had to write you a letter of recommendation prior to your application. And I went to the office to get an appointment, and the secretary said to me, I'm not going to give you an appointment. And I looked at her and I said, well, why not? And she said, because it's a waste of everyone's time. So, as a human being, to be told that you're a waste of everyone's time is crushing and demoralizing and just so inappropriate. But fortunately, I had the fortitude to look at this woman. I said, well, I appreciate that's what you think, but I'm not leaving here until you give me an appointment. And she did. And I walked into a room at the time of this appointment. There are 3 people in the room, the fellow in the center. And imagine you have this long table. 3 people are at the end, you're at the other end. And they're all sitting there like this. Their arms are crossed because you're wasting their time. Mm. And this guy in the center takes my application, he throws it on the table, and he says, say what you have to say so we can get this over with. So I looked at this fellow. I said, who gave you the right to destroy people's dreams? And I said, there's not one shred of evidence that having anything above an average intelligence has any correlation with how good of a doctor you are. And I said, I refuse to allow you to objectify me as a grade or a piece of paper. And I ended up speaking for 30, 45 minutes, doing, the talking. And at the end of it, they were all crying. And the point of this is that once you show someone that you're a human being and you're not this number, they cannot turn away from you. So, as I was walking out, the secretary who had been listening in on this, she had, and this was before we had Xerox machines, she had a, what's it called? A mimeograph trifold green piece of paper she handed me. And it was an application for a summer enrichment program at Tulane University. And she said, I want to give this to you. I think it might help you. It's for socioeconomically disadvantaged and minority students. And I said, well, I appreciate that. She said, but, the deadline has passed for this. But she said, I don't think it'll affect you getting it. So, in fact, I did apply. I went to this program. It was a wonderful experience. And I applied to Tulane. And it's the only place I got an interview, and they accepted me. Now, the interesting thing is that I did not even have enough credits to graduate. The average grade point average at Tulane at that time, if I recall, is about 3.79, which is, I think, an A minus or something. My grade point average was 2.53. So they accepted me with that grade point average without a medical or without an undergraduate degree, and there you have it. Now,
Wow.
if you were to fast forward, to more recently, obviously I didn't have any problems with medical school or residency or anything. If you fast forward after Hurricane Katrina, and Tulane is in New Orleans. New Orleans was flooded. The medical school shut down for 2 years. The dean resigned when they were and the library was severely damaged. When they decided to come back, they were looking for a new dean, and he wanted an endowed chair, which, of course, as you probably know, this is a very high academic honor, but they cost usually a few $1 million. So when this happened to Tulane, by this time I had become a neurosurgeon and a successful entrepreneur. I ended up making a donation to Tulane, which endowed the dean's chair, and he's the Doty professor. I rebuilt the library and set up some other scholarships and chairs. And it shows you how no one can predict anyone's success. And that if you believe in yourself and what you're trying to accomplish, you can do anything. And in fact, I ended up also being the speaker at what we call the white coat ceremony. And I don't know if you know what that is, but prior to starting medical school, there's a ceremony where you get a white coat, you take the oath of Hippocrates, and then they typically have an inspirational speaker come. And I was that person one year. And of course, you can imagine what an incredible honor that was to be asked to speak.
Wow. Wow. The odds were against you at every point, and you just defied them and exceeded them.
Yes. So, and this is, again, this is available to everyone. Now, it's not to say everyone's going to become a doctor or a neurosurgeon, but everyone can do things in their lives that they don't think are possible for them because of other people's judgments about them. And that's what we do, is we let other people's judgments affect how we believe in ourselves or how we see ourselves. And so, yeah, I ended up doing that. I also was a successful entrepreneur. I ended up giving $30 million to charity and set up health clinics all over the world. And then I founded this center at Stanford with the Dalai Lama, and we published a fair amount of work in that space. And fundamentally, at the end of the day, when you can be kind to yourself, when you can be compassionate to yourself, it changes your own physiology, but it also impacts everyone around you. And it gives you the tools, the resilience to not be afraid about the consequences. And what I mean by that is, even in this interview, you can see that I get emotional. And the thing about society is that we judge people oftentimes by looking at them as if they're weak or something if they show emotions. And the reality is the people who can show emotions are usually the strongest people in the room because they're not afraid. So many people's behavior is temporized by they think they're going to be judged by somebody. And the reason that's the case is in modern society, unlike, let's say, a few hundred years ago when you grew up in a village, in that village, everyone knew you, they knew your parents, they knew you from the time you were born, and they accepted you and they gave you love. And even if your parents weren't available, the community, the village itself would watch out for you. And they saw you at your worst, your best, and lo and behold, they still loved you. And in modern society, we don't have that. We don't have access to our parents, our brothers, our sisters, our grandparents. And so we're put into these environments that are stressful. And most people think that if they show their vulnerability or tell the truth about their situation, that they're going to be judged and not accepted. This is why people, they work in a cubicle their whole lives next to someone else, and people ask them every day, how are you doing? They go, oh, everything's fine. But in fact, many of these people have loved ones who are ill, have had tragedies, et cetera, and they don't feel open enough to share that. And as a result, you keep saying these platitudes that allow you to survive and not be hurt deeply, but they also stop you from true connection with others. And what I tell people is, to be who you are, not be afraid of it. I've made multiple mistakes, and I'm a human being. And the nature of making mistakes, being a human being, is you're not perfect, nor are you ever going to be perfect. All you can do is to live in the moment and do the best you can do with the tools that you have. And if people don't like that, well, that's not your problem, that's their problem. I was giving a lecture one time, and I was talking about something that I felt was important and a personal experience, and my voice cracked. I think I shed a tear. And afterwards, a woman comes up to me and she says, oh my God, I felt so sorry for you up on the stage. I noticed that your voice cracked and you were shedding tears, and oh, it must have been so painful, everyone looking at you. And she said, I'm a psychiatrist and also a hypnotist. And if you come to me for 3 sessions, I'll get rid of that for you. And I looked at her and thanked her, and I said, I'm just fine as I am. So I think being authentic, carrying yourself as who you are, not being afraid of that, is really very, very important. And in fact, when you look at companies or businesses, Google did an experiment a number of years ago because they wanted to understand what makes a successful team and team leader. And in the early days of Google, which was, I would suggest, was founded by people with some degree of Asperger's, their view of the world was that only if you're in the top 5% of the class of only 15 universities or so are you worthy to work at Google, because of course the best ideas would come from those people. And what they found was, as they acquired more companies, and many people didn't fulfill those criteria and continued to work at Google, they started studying this. And they found, after spending, I think, many millions of dollars, a couple of things. The first thing was that your grade point average had zero to do with you being a successful leader or what college you went to. Zero, nothing. Domain experience had little to do with your success as a leader. What were the most important things? Authenticity, showing who you really are to people, being non-judgmental, allowing people to fail. And it's these types of critical attributes that allow someone to live a successful life. And I don't necessarily mean money-wise. I'm talking about being a good human being. Young people especially get caught up in this view that, I'm nothing unless I live in a big house or drive an expensive sports car or whatever. And as I said earlier, many of those people are some of the most unhappy people in the world. I myself I've had 9 Porsches, 3 Ferraris, Maseratis, Mercedes, and I lived in a massive house overlooking the ocean. And in the middle of all of that, I was more unhappy than I had ever been. And the reality was, I kept thinking if I get more and more stuff, I can take this sense of shame and unworthiness, and it would be fixed by these things. And it did nothing to do that. In fact, it actually made it worse. And ultimately, the only way you can fix these things is within yourself, because that's where it manifests itself. So I spent a great deal of time working on that aspect. And while all of these, living in a big house and having a great car and all of that is wonderful, the most important thing is to have peace of mind and to accept yourself with all your deficiencies, but also with all your unique aspects, because that makes a human life, that makes life worth meaning. And to fall back on the reality of how being compassionate, not only to yourself, but to others, actually changes everything.
I said 3 words in the whole interview.
Sorry.
No, it's incredible. And this is for the men and women living in prison, and the words and the wisdom that you imparted, I think will really expand their horizons. Is there something they can do to increase their intention? Any advice on getting that intention so that they can start moving forward in their lives?
Well, as I said, the thing that helped me is, I made a list of 10 things I wanted to accomplish. Now, you have to remember, these are, I would suggest, because not that I believe in karma, but maybe I do, they can't be against someone. They have to be helpful, right? But I made a list of 10 things that I wanted to accomplish. And every day I would write each of them down. I would read the list. I would go through it in my head. I would visualize myself being in that position. And that is how you do it. And if you truly live with that, you'll start seeing change pretty immediately. The other aspect, which I didn't bring up, was at the end of that lecture I gave at my medical school, I wanted to impart with these students something that, in looking at the arc of my own career, that would be helpful to them. And it came down to 10 letters of the alphabet, which are C through L. And this is a mantra that I basically say every morning. I wake up and I sit and I breathe and relax. I think of joy and awe of being in this world. And then with intention, I start at C and end in L. And C is compassion for self and others. D is recognizing the dignity of every person. E is practicing equanimity. F is practicing forgiveness. G is having gratitude. H is humility. I is having integrity and values that you live by. J is justice or a sense of fairness towards others. K is just kindness, simply being good for no other reason, all contained by love. And that is the mantra that I live by every day.
Dr. James Doty, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom, and hopefully you'll come back and maybe we can explore the alphabet in a little more depth.
Sure. And actually, one of the things I'm going to be doing at the beginning of the year is a podcast. So if any of your listeners are interested, hopefully it'll probably be at jamesrdotymd.com. I'm working on all that now, but that should be available as well.
We'll put a link in the notes when it comes out.
Okay.
Thank you again, Dr. Doty.
You take care.
Okay.